currently the 14th pastor of the historic Beulah Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia, which has served the community for over 157 years. In addition to his pastoral and ministerial calling, Reverend Q works to advance the patient and physician voice into policy and research deliberations where he engages members of Congress, Capitol Hill staffers, and other government stakeholders to develop and progress laws that affect healthcare. Additionally, Reverend Professor Q is an adjunct professor of legislative politics at George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management. He is also an opinion contributor for Washington, D.C.'s top political news site, The Hill. His work has been featured in national and international news outlets, including the New York Times, Voice of America, NBC News, MSNBC, Religion News Service, Religion Politics, the BBC, and Showtime's The documentary The Fourth Estate. Reverend Q has served on the board for several national and local organizations, including Alexandria's Community Remembrance Project, where he is one of our dedicated steering committee members. Reverend Professor Driskell completed his undergraduate studies at Morehouse College and graduate studies at Harvard University and the George Washington University. It's now my great pleasure to turn over the podium, as it would be, to Reverend Q. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, for that gracious introduction. And to the audience for your patience again, and for your vigilance. I would like to now to introduce this distinguished panel that we have here with us this afternoon. Friends, first is Jacqueline Balavora, who was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and lived in Antwerp, Belgium for 6 years before her family relocated to Victoria, Texas. The experience of attending high school and middle school in Texas formed and shaped her understanding of race in America. While she is currently a lawyer and a professor of sociology and criminal justice at St. Xavier University, she's also a former Chicago police officer. She holds a PhD from Northwestern University and has been engaged in anti-racism training since the 1990s. John West Bay is an independent curator and museum consultant based in Washington, D.C. He is also a lecturer and in the Masters of Arts in Museum Studies program at Johns Hopkins University. During and over his 23-year career, John has curated over 50 exhibitions and produced and managed numerous award-winning public educational and multimedia programs over multiple disciplines, including history, art, and cultural studies. He's also the founder of the American Poetry Museum in Washington, D.C., and has spent 10 years as its executive director. And the filmmaker, Darnley R. Hodge Jr., is an award-winning photojournalist and video editor with more than 20 years of broadcast production experience. He holds a master's in film production from American University and a BS in mass communication from the Virginia Commonwealth University. His work has been featured in NBC, CNBC, and Cox National Networks. He has traveled extensively and has worked extensively in East, West, and Central Africa, South America, Central America, the United Kingdom, as well as the West Indies. Immediately following graduate school, he decided to shoot, travel, and interview the footage that we recently saw entitled The American Legacy of White Supremacy. Thank you all for being here. And we got a little into the conversation when we were having some technical difficulties. But I want to leave off, or I want to start, I should say, excuse me, with a question that has been posed in the chat regarding the violence towards Black men. And so we see, of course, that there has been an extraordinarily exhibited violence towards Black men, but talk a little about the violence also against Black women, then and even presently. And John, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I believe that violence happens against Black communities by whites for the same reason why there's violence amongst any community, when you're consistently taught that you're undervalued, that there's no value to Black life, then uh, you take it. You undervalue it. You don't feel like it's necessary. And so we see that with the killings of Black men, young Black men, men of any age. There's certainly other forms of violence that are unique to women. There is violence in the medical field where women are, Black women specifically, are misdiagnosed. They're not sought to be understood. I remember a few years ago there was a quote from somebody that said that, you know, there would be less crime if all Black babies were aborted or something. So there are plenty of examples of just a devaluing, and I don't think this as a group, males or females, men or Black men or women, are just generally devalued. And I think we've seen that in the film, that it started almost from the beginning, before the country started, that there's just a devaluing of Black people. And whether it's violence against women, whether it's violence against men, um, it's something that should be stopped. It's something that should be advocated by by people of all backgrounds.
And if I can just add to that, I think it's important to understand and to keep in mind, I tend to try to view current events in the proper context as being part of a continuum. Nothing happens right now spontaneously. Everything has a cause, and everything has a history behind it. And the important thing to remember is that for Black Americans, most of us, when we do our DNA test, we'll find out we have about 20% European blood in us, if those of us who are born here. And that speaks to the continued violence against Black women for generations, because that is largely the result of rape against Black women. We tend to think about the violence in terms of killing. Black men may be murdered, be taken out by a bullet, but for every Black man taken out by a bullet, you can trust that there are probably multiple Black women who have been victims of sexual violence, at the very least, if not actual physical, abusive violence, in terms of the way we think of it, in terms of, attacked in that kind of way. So, the history of violence against Black women absolutely goes back just as far as it does against Black men. And part of the reason that the violence against Black men exists is to leave Black women vulnerable for these attacks, Black women and children. And again, we can go on an entire conversation just about the destruction of the Black family. But that, I believe, when we look at the history, we will definitely see that, like John mentioned, violence comes in many ways, and Black women have been catching it just as bad or worse than Black men the entire time that we've been on this soil.
Jackie, did you have any?
I would love to jump in here with a couple additions. First of all, just as a reminder, as Darnley Hodge has already alerted us to, we saw through the enslavement of people of African descent, the commodification of Black women's bodies, right? They were literally made machines of production, making more goods, things. And so it incentivized, the economic piece incentivized sexual assault. And so, and then that had to be justified, right? You can't have a good white European Christians engaging this activity unless there's a justification that makes that okay. And so then you had the narratives of the Jezebel, the sexual predator narratives directed at Black women to then justify this assault and violence by largely white European men. So I wanted to assert that in. And then one other point I'd love to make is that in this very specific moment in time in the 1680s, because look, prior to 1680, if you study the legal record of colonial North America, there is not a single reference to anyone called a white person. And of course, there were plenty of people with low levels of melanin in their skin like me, but they were not called white. They did not conceive of themselves as white. And white is not referenced in the historical record. So when you had this new invention called white people being asserted, it was in and through this assertion of this new group of people called white people that colonial society, that the English colonies were radically reorganized. And how were they reorganized? They created a brand new bottom to colonial society and tossed people of African descent and Native Americans in that bottom. And this is where you see the laws that then stripped African men and African American men of their patriarchal power and authority. If you, right, because the arrangement in heterosexual marriages was that his job is to provide and protect, and men of African descent were denied that opportunity as a matter of law, right? They couldn't possess a gun. They could before, but not now that white people are invented. Now they no longer can. And so they were systematically denied access to patriarchal power, much less social and political power.
So in the film, there's a title that says The White Responsibility. And juxtapose that with the inauguration that many of us heard and listened to, where President Biden discussed and mentioned numerous times unity. When we think about responsibility, what responsibility do white Americans have, particularly as what was striking for me in the film, the number of atrocities committed throughout history and the sort of people that were held up: Leopold, Rhodes, Hitler, 1 million Aborigines, 6 million Jews, 20 million natives, 200 million Africans. So whose responsibility is it, or what responsibility do whites bear? That's the first question. And secondly, is it not all of our responsibility to bring forth some form of unity?
I'm happy to start that one off.
Sure.
In terms of the responsibility that white people bear, I believe that first, if I may, I'd like to begin by actually defining what it means to be white today. What it means to be white is to be born into a society within a nation that from its founding moment built every single institution, from lending, from law, policing, housing, Hollywood. Every single institution of the nation was constituted with your racial group being centered, whiteness centered, so that they were all put together in a way with the interests and perspectives of white people, to ensure white people's advancement and success. And so to be born into that society labeled white from the moment of your birth, as I was, it means that I am lifted to the top of the pile relative to people who are seen as part of other racial groups. And so there's not one part of society within which that is not playing out, from the most fundamental of interactions on the street to all of the things going on all around me at this moment, from my banking happening right now to what's going on at the university where I work. Everywhere I am being conferred the advantage of being central to what counts as education. And so with that being said, so then what responsibility do white people bear? We bear the responsibility of learning the truth that this film helps to illuminate. We have the responsibility to demand that truthful American history be told. We bear the responsibility of confronting our own investment in continuing and preserving whiteness so that we can build a nation and communities where liberty access, opportunity, freedom, these ideals of the nation, that we are striving more toward them.
Sorry, anyone else want to take up on that question?
Yeah, I'll add to that some. I mean, the thing, just to piggyback on something that Jackie just said, it's important to understand that there's no place on planet Earth where, again, white people are governed, educated, policed, fed, housed by non-white people, okay? Anywhere on planet Earth. And then you have to ask, okay, well, how did that become the case? And then how is that still the case? And what are the societal norms that are in place that allow that to continue to be the case, right? What's necessary in order to maintain that is a societal, is an ideology that people have to buy into in order to make that okay. And the responsibility, as Jackie so eloquently stated, is to not allow, to expose oneself to the truth about what the situation is, and then to decide to make a conscious decision about where you fall in that. See, my perspective on this is different than a lot of people's. I do agree that racism should end, right? But I'm also of the mind that if those of us who are the victims of racism have our perspective together, we could create this environment where racism no longer matters. You follow me? So I do agree that yes, we should end racism. On the other hand, it's one of these things where it doesn't matter what you teach in your schools, if we develop our own schools, can teach our own children. You follow me? It doesn't matter if you're hiring us or not, if you want to discriminate against my name because it sounds black on an application, because I have plenty of places where I can go and apply it with black business owners and work for them. See, the reality is, you have millions of white people in America and in white countries throughout the world who they're born as a baby in a white hospital to a white doctor, go to a white preschool, white elementary school, middle school, high school, go to a white college, graduate from that white college, get employed by a white employer, provide for their white family, retire from that white employer, and have never dealt with anybody non-white their entire life. This is the lived experience for millions and millions of white people worldwide. As a black person, I would like to have that option as well. You follow me? I would like to be able to send my child to a black school, have them go up through black middle school, high school, et cetera, go to a black college, graduate, be employed by a black employer, provide for their black family, and retire, and all of that, being able to deal with people within our community as well. Now, what I think having that diversity of actual access and power in terms of not begging for a seat at somebody else's table or participate in somebody else's system, but developing your own comparable system, I think that ultimately will create the unity that everybody's looking for. In other words, there will be an equal exchange of value. Nobody wants to feel as though, or nobody wants to be in a situation, and even say in a personal relationship, where somebody wants to be in a relationship with you, but you have all the resources and they want to be a part of your household because you have the nice house, you got the nice car, and they want to be a part of all that. No, get your own house, get your own car, and you'll find somebody who you'll be equally yoked with. You know what I mean? So I'm not a fan of the school of thought that is a one-way this one-sided sort of unity. You know what I mean? This idea that, how do we, because right now I think a lot of times when people talk about unity, it's outside the context of black power, about black people having any real power. You follow me? That's one of the things that I've said before when it comes to even we can talk about how America has never been truly integrated or, desegregated, but it really was never even truly segregated either, because if it was truly segregated, we would have had a black president and a white president, a black mayor and a white mayor of each town, a black police department and a white police department. We never had that kind of segregation. The power was always all white. They just segregated the resources at the bottom, So my point is this: having an all-white power structure that more benevolently distributes the resource at the bottom isn't that much better. It's about having equal access and equality up and down the ranks, not just vertically, not just horizontally, if that makes sense. Yep. So if that is indeed the case, if indeed we're after a situation where black people have power and have control over our own resources, our own destiny, et cetera, To me, that is a more attainable goal, and it's something that we can achieve literally by a switch in mentality, and a change in priority. And if we put our energy into building up and bolstering our own resources, we'll create an environment whereby we actually have true power. We have things within society that people have to come through us to get and negotiate with us fairly in order to get them. Well, that's all that we're looking for. That's all, equality and unity and all this stuff is an even, fair exchange of value. Okay, two people get together and I'm not taking advantage of you. I'm not exploiting you. You want this, I want that, and we come to an agreement. And once Black people are in that position, the unity and all that stuff will take care of itself. Right now, we're in a position where there's nothing Black people really have that can't be taken, including us. Okay, so once we shore that up, everything else I believe will fall into place. So the white responsibility of that would be to just leave us alone. Don't sabotage us. That's historically what has happened is when we have developed our own power base and our own resources, they've been sabotaged. They've been undermined. And we need to do a better job of defending ourselves in that regard. But if there's any white responsibility, it would be the responsibility to recognize that, listen, let me leave these people be and let them do what they want to do. And it's not my place to intervene and to try to undermine or to sabotage any of their efforts to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps.
Thank you both. I see a question in the chat directed towards you, Darnley. It says, please say a little bit more about what moved you following the extrajudicial killings of men and boys like Trayvon Martin. What message do you want to send to Americans and to the audience, particularly about white supremacy through this film?
It's important to understand that most of the films and just media that we see in general are aimed at a general audience, or aimed at a multicultural audience. This is primarily for a Black audience, because this is for Black people to better understand our own situation. And the reason for me that's important is because a lot of times we'll buy into the narratives that are given to us by the mainstream sort of outlets, and we'll think that that is indeed the route to solving our problem when it isn't. So getting back to the specifics of the question, when I'm hearing these conversations about Trayvon Martin's killing, and they want to make Trayvon Martin or Oscar Grant or any of the extrajudicial killings you could think of, they want to make it the conversation always centered around, say, the police or the culture of policing, or this guy George Zimmerman. It wasn't about this guy. It wasn't about these police officers. This is about a culture that produced these people. I'll put it to you this way: if someone who is of the Islamic faith blows up a building, right? They don't say, hey, it's just that individual. They look at, this media will look at their entire culture that person comes from. They'll look at their nation, they'll look at how they grew up, they'll look at the entire culture and they'll come to the conclusion that it is this culture over here that produced this terrorist, right? But when we're being terrorized by white people, they want to say, well, it's just that individual. And I'm saying, no, let's look at the culture. Let's look at the culture that is producing these police officers. Let's look at the culture that produced a George Zimmerman. You follow me? Because even though the mentality that they express comes out in its most violent iterations, or we talk about it when it comes out in its most violent iterations in terms of somebody actually shooting a Black man, that Black man who was shot, trust me, he ran into that same mentality from his teachers in school. He ran into that same mentality from the person who looked at his job application and said, his name is Trayvon, that sounds too Black, I'm not gonna hire this guy. So he was actually, Trayvon Martin was, yes, he was killed by George Zimmerman, but trust me, he's missed out on opportunities at other parts of his life. And there are other people who've attacked him in the way that they had access to. They didn't have a gun like Zimmerman did, but they might've had a pen and decided to, put an X where they could have put a check mark. You follow me? So that's what this is about. This film was about getting us to better understand the true breadth and depth of the mentality that we're up against, so that we can come up with our own solutions, deliberate, strategic solutions, as opposed to knee-jerk reactions or taking responses or following the prescribed responses that are given to us by somebody who's not in our situation, who's not within our culture. And so getting back to the specific question, what was missing from the coverage that I felt should have been included, it is the focus on the overall culture. See, the mainstream media never wanted to focus on the culture of white supremacy. They only wanted to focus on the individual the individual actor, or if anything, they might talk about the culture of policing, right? But they don't want to talk about the culture of whiteness because, again, they're part of it. So, you know, you're only going to want to, you know, you're only going to go but so deep, you know. So, so that's my answer to that.
Darnley, if I could offer one thing to that, I as a professor, a teacher, and as a person who lectures very much to white majority audiences about, you know, the history, the invention of white people, I can say that white people who are interested in addressing racial justice struggle tremendously with seeing the culture of white supremacy, right? It's like the air we breathe, so we can't even see it. It's like a fish in water. You don't know you're in water. And so I'm recommending your film for white audiences because it's such an amazing resource for white people to start to see, to have tools, conceptual tools, historical tools, analytical tools for seeing whiteness. So I find it incredibly valuable for a white audience for that particular purpose. So thank you for the resource.
And if I can pick up on what you're saying too, is I remember I gave a talk a few years ago to a convention about historic houses. I do a lot of talks with museums. And the name of the conference was called Having Difficult Conversations in Historic Houses. Now, that automatically, you know, sets the tone. It's a majority white audience, and so one of the things that I said was that I've been black a long time, and black people don't have a uncomfortability about talking about race. We talk about race all the time. We talk about race at home. We talk with our friends about it, and so you have to, one, if you decide to be uncomfortable about it, you have to explore why, the roots of that uncomfortability. And two is when you walk into a historic home, and most likely a historic home, it's been historically owned by a white slave owning family, somebody that you would consider elite, somebody in today's terms you would consider a one percenter. If you go into that house as a white person, as a you know, as Dr. Balavora says, the masses, and you walk into that historic house and you automatically identify with that white owner of the house, then that's a choice. And you have to recognize it as a choice, because more than likely, most white people are descended from people who are not descended from that 1%. They're people who either came here through Ellis Island, or they came through here through some means other than through the top. And so you have to find ways to put aside that whiteness and realize that it's a choice to identify with someone that has very little in common with you historically. And that's how, as a white person, you start to unlearn that, because most white people were not rich. They did not come from wealth. And in fact, they have been manipulated into believing that that's the history that separates them from the African American experience.
Thank you.
We lost your mic again, Quad. Yeah.
We focused on the adults, but let's get to the children. And that's a question from a parent that says, how do we as parents make sure that our children are being told the truth about race, racism, white supremacy when they are outside of our care, in schools, in college, in their friend circles? How do we force that they watch television shows that tell the truth when it is clear that there is very little truth telling about what actually happened everywhere?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, you know, I have 3 small children, and I could say you know, I just immerse them in their history and in facts. You know, obviously I don't give them things that aren't appropriate for their ages. You know, my children are 5, 2, and 8 months. So obviously the littlest one, she's not reading or writing anything yet. But for the 2 older ones, you know, they have their books and their toys, and you know, but I just teach them the truth from this age, you know. So as far as what they're learning elsewhere, you know, I'm aware of what my daughter learns, for example, with her preschool class, and we'll supplement that, you know. You know, they're a lot of times their teacher will ask them, oh, you know, where's some place you wanna travel, and she'll, or what's some, you know, what's the name of some you know, they'll be talking about history, whatever, and she'll throw out, you know, Songhai or Ghana, or, you know what I mean? Or, you know, the Maasai, my son's name is Maasai, as a matter of fact. But, you know, they're aware of these things. So, I mean, it's really just have to teach your own children. You never really want to leave, you know, you never really want to leave anybody else to be responsible for, you know, your child's development at the end of the day, you know. So, you know, they're gonna get value from the public school system, private school system, but it's also important to stay on top of what they're doing and fill in some of the gaps that are guaranteed to be there in what they're learning in the classroom.
Well, it's also a unique belief that the education of your children only happens at a school. It happens all day. From the time they wake up, the rituals that you put in place for your children are of your own design. Even the idea of you know, of communicating with your children about what they're learning outside of the home. I know I communicate with my kids constantly about what they've been told, and you correct those things. It has to be intentional.
Yeah, we know from studies, right, that if parents aren't addressing um, issues of race and sexuality and gender and religion, what they're not learning officially at school, if you're not addressing it explicitly as a parent, then pop culture's filling it in for them. How frightening is that, right? And the only other thing I'd like to add is that, y'all, we pay taxes. We own, if you live in a home, you're paying taxes. And so you have a voice in what's happening in the schools. And so I think another thing that we can do, it's not going to help your child in right now, in the immediate sense. So I think Darnley is so correct, and you have to provide that. Don't trust a school to do it. But if we want to make sort of a systemic change, then we've got to join forces as parents and demand that schools utilize, again, honest history. And the teachers don't even know most of the honest history, and it's not even provided for the most part at the collegiate level, training teachers to be teachers of social studies and history. And so, you know, it's time for us to demand that history get a good looking at, and the whitewashing stripped away and addressed, an honest history told, because white people are harmed by this system of white supremacy. We are harmed in that our humanity is diminished. Our fundamental capacity to have compassion for over 70% of the globe's population, i.e. not white people, because whiteness teaches us to have empathy for white people and to have less, if any, for non-white people. And we can see that structurally throughout US history. And I'll just make one quick example that's contemporary. Think about the crack addiction that plagued cities across this nation. African-American communities disproportionately impacted by it. And how did we respond? We, especially white people, disproportionately in positions of power. And how did we, the people, demand they respond? You better be tough on crime, President Clinton. Mayors, law enforcement, we want more police out there, build more prisons. We were fine with having our tax dollars filtered in those ways. Now flip to 2010. Another addiction crisis plaguing this country. This time the drug is opioids, and this time communities disproportionately impacted were white and economically advantaged. And how did we, the people, respond? Did we say incarcerate, incarcerate? No, we responded with compassion, because we white people, through white supremacy, can see white people as frickin' human beings. And we do not confer that same humanity to people of color, especially people of African descent and indigenous people. So white people have our humanity at stake in this project of addressing and dismantling white supremacy.
John, this question is directed towards you specifically. Do you believe that we are experiencing a pivotal moment regarding media coverage, including faces of color who are being covering news and hosting? And what is the significance of this emergence regarding the narrative of people of color?
Well, since the beginning, since the entire history of America, we've always had a media. And I think that, who is it? Ed from the film talked really well about it, where he talked about even the first newsletter, the Boston newsletter, has a bias to say that black men are addicted to stealing, I believe is what he said. And it as technology and as time goes by, you have more pervasive media. It goes from certain people, certain curators of telling the American story, who are literate, who have that filter, to now everybody who has a phone can tell that story, and then any news media can pick up that story and take it upon themselves to use it to their own advantage. And I mean, I think specifically about the banning of the previous president, banning people off of social media, and banning Parler, I believe is the name of the situation. But there are also respected media organizations that also can spread white supremacy. And to me, you could call it a milder version. Certainly the language is more mild, but the effect is still strong. You can call yourself a progressive news media, but if you are using different language to promote the same thing, it's equally harmful. So it's no different than what I said to these folks who were attending this conference. Is you now have to make a choice to say, how am I choosing to view this information when I sit down to write this story and to expose millions of people to these ideas? What am I bringing to this? I remember I was on a advisory board to a media outlet, and we were talking about the promotion of arts, of African American artists. And this person said, well, in Washington, D.C., there's a predominantly black area that's east of the river, so it's called Southeast D.C. And they said, well, we don't really want to just promote Southeast DC, and the code word was black artists. He said, well, we have to promote the regular artists, the Kennedy Center. We have to promote, all the things that in their mind were legitimate. Now, this is a national media outlet that I'm talking about. And so their mind is in this very fluffy language, and these are considered very progressive people. In their mind, they automatically discount the black artists. They're for Black History Month. They're not for promoting all the time. And this is just a small example of how you can take the strength of the media voice, but unchecked, it can still promote equally damaging messages.
Yeah, and I think that having a black face on top of that message doesn't really change that. I mean, the thing, it's one thing that it's a sort of it's almost a semantic thing, but not really, because one of the terms that I've been putting out lately is this idea of Afrophobia. It's not just about racism. In other words, this is a cultural phobia as well. In other words, you'll hear white people say, well, I'm not racist. Hey, I have black friends, that kind of thing, right? But the black friends they might have are people who, but for their skin, is aligned with that white person in every way. They like the same music, they like the same sports teams, they use the same sort of language, then they have the same sorts of names, they send their kids to the same sorts of schools. And what you'll find is that disconnect between the white person who's friendly with black people who are culturally aligned with them versus black people who are not culturally aligned with them. Respecting the black person named Malik or Jamal as much as the guy named John or Jack, who happens to be black. You know, so this is also about respecting an African, there's a cultural aspect to this too, and Black people do have our own culture, and we do have a culture that is unique to our experience here in America. However, a lot of times those who, let me put it this way. I was watching an episode of, what's the Inside the Actors Studio? You know, the Inside the Actors Studio, anybody seen that show? And he had Dave Chappelle on a particular episode. And one of the questions that he asked Dave Chappelle was, he said, Dave, you know, when you or Richard Pryor or Eddie Murphy do impressions of white guys, your diction is pitch perfect. And it occurs to me that if you wanted to, you could speak like that all the time. So his question, the implicit question is, well, why don't you? Why you still talk Black when you can talk white so effectively? You follow me? And that's that Afrophobia that I'm talking about. This idea that why would you adhere to a culture that is unique to Black people when you have access to this white culture? And that isn't that indeed your goal? Isn't that indeed your objective, to assimilate and to integrate with us? So I think that fundamental understanding, if that fundamental understanding is still there, it comes out of Black people's mouths, it comes out of, you know, all the time. So I think that having more Black people in the media doesn't necessarily mean that you're necessarily advocating a pro-Black perspective or a pro-Black even mentality or sensibility. That doesn't mean that you're bringing that to the table. I've worked in the media for 25 years. I can tell you, most of these Black folks, they don't live in no Black neighborhoods. I do live in a Black neighborhood. They're not married to a Black person. I am married to a Black person. They're more invested in whiteness than most Black people are. Most Black people live and work and study and these kind of things around other Black people, right? But we have this media, perspective that's put out there when you watch these shows like Blackish or Insecure, and they keep reinforcing this idea of the Black professional being a fish out of water. Like, you know, because you're a person who has a degree and you're gainfully employed, that you must not be part of any Black community, right? You must have left the Black community and be trying to figure out your way in this white world. And that's just not the reality for Black people. You know, for literally the vast majority of Black people deal with other Black people, live and speak and work around other Black people. But the people who represent us in the media don't come from those communities. These are Black people who don't necessarily fit in, who don't necessarily represent the masses of Black people. So yes, I think there is some value to having some Black faces. However, you know, it was important to have Black faces in the police departments. And how does that help Black people? You know, because in order to be a police officer, you have to adopt a particular mentality, and you have to decide, like they say, whether you're Black or you're blue, you know, in a lot of cases. And so therefore, having a Black police officer or a Black judge doesn't necessarily mean you'll get any lighter of a sentence than if a white judge was there, because they have to internalize this culture. So for me, having Black faces in high places don't mean a lot. Having Black faces, it's more so about the what perspective and what sort of representation of Black people is this person, right? And I'm not seeing a lot of that in the mainstream. And again, I've worked in mainstream media for over 25 years, and I know a lot of these people's personal stories and how they spend their personal time, and they could not have made this film, for example.
So Jackie, this question is directed towards you specifically, but I would encourage you all to chime in here. How would you advise us, the audience, regarding obtaining, learning, and researching the history that you studied and that has been exhibited in this film?
Well, you could read the book, Birth of a White Nation, The Invention of White People and Its Relevance Today. It will be out with Routledge Press in June or July of 2021. So that's a way to access it. I have a first edition of the book that's already out there. They've stopped printing it. I'm not sure how available it is right now, but that is the recording of this history that Mr. Hodge interviewed me regarding. And you will find it in the book, including stories about a variety of peoples who came to the shores of North America, and Chinese, Japanese, persons kidnapped from Africa and forced into enslavement, Mexican people who, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, found themselves living in a new country, but they hadn't moved, and who were white by federal law and not white by state law, and Irish Catholics So you'll not only learn the history of the invention in the colonial period, but you'll see how whiteness was given meaning through different groups' experiences here in North America and in the United States. So I recommend that. And there's tons of sources cited in the book itself if you're interested in digging in other ways.
And of course, I would always say, go to a museum. You know,
Yes.
there are hundreds of African American museums all around the country. The most well-known one, of course, is the National African American Museum, which I believe is still closed now, but will reopen one day. And but there's a museum wherever you are in the country, or wherever you are, you can go and see the primary sources. You know, you can read a book, but it's a different thing when you're standing there reading that manifest or reading that primary document to show the history, and then you can make up your own mind once you see the surviving artifacts that tell these stories.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that in addition to both of those, it's very important that after you read this book, after you check out these exhibits, et cetera, to really think about, where do you fall in this? You know, where, you know, like James Baldwin said, you know, it's up to white people to figure out why they invented the N-word. And I don't mean the word, I mean the caricature of the Black person that we call the N-word. You know, they have to figure out why they need this caricature to exist so bad. They have to figure out, why do I need somebody to look down upon so bad? And you have to really look within yourself and decide, hey, and is some of that in me, and do I need to root that out, you know? And that would be for a white listener, but for Black people, I would want to say too, you know, you have to figure out what type of Black person are you? Because there are a couple of types. There are those who decide that they want to move closer to the idea of whiteness in order to help hopefully relieve our situation in some way or improve their condition in some way. Then you have those who figure out they want to move further away from it. There's the Black person who values there's the black person who values white approval. Then there's the Black person who values Black respect for self. There's the Black person who's after freedom. Then there's the Black person who's after success. There's the Black person who's trying to eliminate white supremacy. Then there's the Black person who's merely trying to improve their position within white supremacy. Okay, so you got to decide what kind of Black person are you? Are you out here fighting for equality and justice and just a better, just for white supremacy to be more benevolent towards you? You want whiteness to be nicer to you? Because there are a lot of Black folks that's their actual goal. They're okay with the power structure being what it is. They just want it to be more fair and benevolent and whatever. They're fighting a different fight than I am. You know, I'm fighting the fight for our own power, our own autonomy, et cetera. You know, it's like I said, when you asked me earlier about why I made this film, I said, I'm not going to go in there and try to get NBC to change what they do. Let them do what they do. I'm going to use the power that I have to create my own film. And I use that as an example of the type of mentality that I think will solve our problem overall. And that is, let's use what resources we have to build up to do what we can do, as opposed to relying 100% solely on the benevolence of a third party. We have, for those who paid attention really to the common thread of the solutions that are presented at the end of the film, they are all solutions that are 100% within Black people's power to execute. None of the solutions presented in the film are solutions that are, hey, well, let's go out and try to get more, you know, reach across the aisle or become friends with these, and hopefully somebody else will help us solve our situation. That's not what, or get out and vote. And yeah, that's all important too. But we have it within our own power. We have a lot more power than we realize, and or than we often act on. And I believe once we start doing that, we will create a situation whereby we won't need somebody else's help. We won't need somebody else to do anything for us. I think a lot of times, you know, what's that movie, Failure to Launch? When you probably saw that with Matthew McConaughey when he was a grown man and couldn't move out, needed to move out of his parents' house, right? And I believe as a people, we need to develop that mentality. I think to a large degree, we want a better room in Master's house as opposed to building our own house. Okay, so once we put our energy into that, yeah, it may not be as big and fancy as the big house, but give it time, give it a few generations, we'll be there. You know, so I think you have to figure out where you are. What type of white person are you? What type of Black person are you? And be honest with it, and move forward from there. All I can do is provide additional information with which to inform that decision, hopefully.
So when we think about the larger system, and we know that white supremacy has infiltrated every aspect of society, the question is, don't we have to dismantle capitalism, which fueled white supremacy vis-a-vis slavery first? That's the first question. The second question is, how then do we largely move and close the wealth and economic gap between the races?
I think there are two issues there. When people start talking about closing gaps, again, that is it's a perspective that says, let's constantly compare where we are with somebody else. Right. I'm not big on that. I don't, it's like, yes, it is relevant that there is a wealth gap, there's an education gap, these kind of things. However, if I weigh, if I weigh 500 pounds, right, and you weigh 150 pounds, I can't just keep comparing where I am to you. I have to go where I am in my own weight loss journey, in my own fitness journey, right? And so, it's not very useful for us to concentrate on where we are in comparison to somebody else. We need to think about where we are in comparison to where we can be. It's about me. I may not get from 500 down to 150, but hey, 300 might be realistic for me, and that might be my goal. So let me make that my goal. You follow me? But this idea of Black people constantly measuring where we are in comparison to white people, I think that right there is a fundamental mistake. I think that we need to look at where we are based on where we possibly can be, and make that our goal. Just to wrap up this point, I think because of that, I think we're often given a truncated or limited view of what's possible because of that. And I'll give you an example. I remember years ago, Tavis Smiley had this what he called the Black State of the Union. And it was after Obama got elected, and it was Tavis Smiley. He hosted all these powerful Black thinkers and thought leaders from all over the country were there around the table. He had Jesse Jackson, he had Cornel West, Michael Eric Dyson, Honorable Louis Manchester Farrakhan. He had Julianne Malveaux, all these brilliant Black minds. But one thing, and they had a lot of great ideas at that meeting, but one theme that kept recurring, that I wasn't able to really articulate what I found wrong with it until a little later. And that is, one of the things that kept recurring was, again, this is 2010, so at the time they're saying, we have 40 million Black people in America. If we kind of get on the same page, there's nothing we can't convince this government to do, basically. This government will have to do anything we want it to if we kind of become aligned. My thing is, well, why stop there? Why isn't the vision, if there's 40 million on the same page, we don't need the government to do anything for us. You follow me? And I think that so often the vision that we're given is always in comparison to somebody else, a wealth gap, this gap. I'm not concerned about the gap. I'm concerned about the gap in where we are versus where we could be versus where we are versus where somebody else is. So I think once we kind of set that aside and start just thinking about what our potential is, we'll get a lot further, a lot faster.
Yeah, I would just add that one of the things I find very interesting, Darnley, in relation to that gap that's so often referenced with regard to education, right? The race gap in education, is that it's always between white is the reference point, right? It's centered again. And there is a gap between white students and Asian students, but we're not talking about that, right? And the Asian students aren't, and African, not African-American, but African students who are performing better, right? So I can't agree more that reference that always is centering white people as the ideal to which everybody else should aspire is just fundamentally problematic. And furthermore, not only is just we could dig in more to the depth of the problems with that comparison, because when it's centered around white people, it's also the measurement by which others are measured is based upon white people's interest, white people's histories, white people's ways of learning that have been imposed on everyone else. And so it's even more problematic as we dig in deeper and deeper.
Oh, what occurred to me, we never really addressed the capitalism question directly.
So very briefly, if you all could just, what about the capitalistic structure
Yeah, I mean, well, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy all go together. You know what I'm saying? It was, this was country was originally for white males of property. You know what I mean? We're the only real citizens who had any kind of power. So yeah, I believe that they're all sort of inextricable. You know what I mean? And that there needs to be, the, capitalism is a tougher capitalism itself is a tougher nut because of the global nature of the economy these days. You know what I mean? So when we're talking about domestic policy in terms of like, racial policy, that's one thing, or racial interactions. But when you're talking about, an international economy, I wouldn't even know where to begin in terms of trying to counteract that. I mean, I'm a filmmaker at the end of the day, that's just a much bigger nut to crack. I do think though that by addressing some of the structural inequity in terms of racially, we can at least have an opportunity to have a more even distribution of capitalism, an opportunity for capitalism. I mean, I think the issue is not with capitalism itself. Just like, for example, the problem isn't with communism itself or socialism itself. It's all about how it's run. You know what I mean? All of these ideologies on their face make sense and can be effective if they're run the way they're supposed to. The problem is people cheat, and so that jams things up as well. So do I think that capitalism is just fundamentally, is there a problem just fundamentally with capitalism itself? Not necessarily. Just like there's not fundamentally a problem with communism or socialism or even a dictatorship for that matter, but who's the dictator, right? So that's really what it comes down to. It all comes down to how a system is realistically and really actually being rolled out and being and playing out on a day-to-day basis.
So friends, we're scheduled to end around 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're willing to go about 15 to 10 minutes over if that's agreeable to everyone. The next to last question, so if you have questions, I should say, just please send them in the chat as I can clearly see them and they can flow through. But a question that has been on everyone's mind, the last 4 years, we have seen our country divided amongst racial lines, religious lines, ethnicity lines. And I should note that that division is not because of Trump. We know that the systemic division has existed long before President Trump got to the Oval Office. Of course, he was just a manifestation of many of the systematic divisions. So when we think about American history and race relations, how do each of you all see a path forward?
Again, the question of race relations to me is, for me, my fundamental focus is on helping Black people to better understand our situation so that we can then help to solve our problem. And I think by us being a strong people, that makes a stronger nation. Nobody else can eat for us, they can't exercise for us, and they can't get free for us. They can't organize our community for us. They can't put Black fathers back in the household for us. They can't create African-centered education, curriculum and these kind of things for us. These are things that we need to do for ourselves. We need to do, so as far as finding a way forward, I believe that by having when you have a strong people, right, they pair up those strengths and move forward together. I think that we've been in a situation where we've had a strong group and a weakened group. And part of the reason America hasn't moved forward is because, you got so much you have a doggone 15% of the nation that you've been, I'm talking about just in terms of Black people, not in terms of the other non-white people and women and everything else, but you're stifling your own ability to move forward because you're artificially suppressing the talent and intelligence and potential contribution of so many other people. So, and keeping people weak. So the reason that this country is in the situation it is in terms of not moving forward is because everybody's not strong. People need to get strong. Communities need to be strengthened. And once that happens, I believe that everybody will benefit. White people will benefit from a strong Black America.
And there's a quote that says, the truth is like a lion. When you let it out, it can defend itself. So I think that is definitely some truth to that. I'm going to reference some research that I'm heavily involved in right now, which is the United States about 100 years ago in the 1920s, where you have a population of Black people that no more than 60 years out of being enslaved, are building their own towns. They're building economic bases. They're using skills that they had learned as enslaved people to now make themselves in their towns and their communities prosperous. This is possible within the context of capitalism. And what do you find as the white response during that time is overt violence, right? You find in the Tulsa race massacre that happened exactly 100 years ago, where this was a community that was self-sufficient. So it clearly isn't just about segregation, as Darnley alluded to earlier, because if that were the case, then why weren't they just left alone? They were left alone to their own devices. But it wasn't good enough to just have an all-black town that's separated from their white counterparts. Their white counterparts looked at their success and said, it can't be better than mine. And you find that not only in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you find that in Florida, you find that in all across Oklahoma itself, you find that in Texas, you find that all across the country where black people are told, okay, you're not good enough to be around white people, so go be off by yourself. They go off by themselves, educate themselves, build a capitalist system amongst themselves, and they're still attacked. So the way forward is, as Darnley is saying, is you can't be a fair broker with someone if you don't have the same power. And it isn't about black separatism. It's really more about getting what you deserved. The whole point of the country is supposed to be about the pursuit of happiness. And every time black people have done that, there's been some sort of new barrier that keeps you from just having that basic ability to generate wealth, to generate capital. And so, to build on Darnley's point, really, I think the way forward is to stop, stop messing with us, to leave us alone. Let us prosper so that we can be on the same playing field with you, so we can deal as honest brokers.
Yeah, John, I think the points that you raise about this history, right, of there have been plenty of evidence of self-sufficiency and a positive mindset of power and strength on the part of people of African descent throughout this country's history. And white people have come in and plowed through their communities and their economic success from Florida to Maine, from New York to California when we built our highway systems. We did it with housing policy when we made our country more racially divided than it was before. So I think what this suggests is that it's a both and. You can't just have the mindset of being powerful and empowering oneself. You have to have the policy component that is going to ensure that the governments aren't going to come through and plow you down when you show again your great success, your incredible intelligence, the power of Black people empowered. And so with regard to that both and, I would like to also fold in that it is my belief that this nation needs to address reparations for enslavement and the century of policies thereafter that continued to deny people of African descent access, opportunity. And because it is my belief that white people in the United States need it, that the nation needs it. We need that honest coming to terms to the distribution of wealth through the form of capitalism that has taken hold here. And I am concerned. I don't have such a strong a belief in capitalism as has been expressed so far. I have not seen it demonstrated anywhere on the planet in a way that's particularly hopeful to me. So I think that stronger socialistic programs seem to offer a more promising approach to address the inequalities that the form of capitalism we have had here has created. And we've, the fact that we just hold ourselves out in this country as exclusively capitalist is simply not true. We have had socialistic programs. We still have them. In
Still
fact,
do.
many of them are held most dear to people across the nation, from Social Security to Medicare to Medicaid. So I think we need both and. We need to not just, Ibram Kendi focuses on policy. Darnley Hodge is focusing on that individual choice and self-sufficiency, and African-American community come together for empowerment. And to me, it's all of them. It's going to take all of them for us to get where I hope we move as a people, as a nation.
I would say too, though, keep in mind that for someone like myself, unity comes after we get repaired. You follow me? Like, in other words, my priority isn't uniting with anybody else, it's getting my own people strong, and then once that happens, then we can deal with whatever happens after that, basically from a position of strength. But it's like, if we've been mowed down by a car, I'm sitting in the hospital on life support, right? My priority is just getting healed, just getting out of that hospital bed, getting this cast off, learning to walk again, right? Learning to talk again because my jaw's been broken, getting back in a position of strength. And then from there, I can go ahead and deal with the person who might have hit me in the car, or, suing them or whatever. I'm not thinking about none of that. All I'm trying to do is get strong again. And so I think that the question of unity, at least coming from a Black person's perspective, is really the secondary question. The first question is, how do Black people get strong again? How do Black people get out of our situation? And assuming that we won't get help from anybody, assuming that it persists, assuming that the racism will never end, let's assume that it even gets worse. We have a historical record that we can pull from, that we can devise ways with which to defend ourselves against, like what John was saying about the sabotage, when we did have our own thriving Black communities and towns and infrastructure and these kind of things. We can still take a lesson from that, rebuild it, but then now have some things to defend ourselves against those that we know will eventually come along to try to undermine it. Now, after that's in place, now we can start talking about, creating treaties and creating, and I'm using treaties as just a metaphor, but, when they were establishing America as a country, they weren't working out trade agreements with people overseas. They were just establishing their own country. You know what I mean? So it's after America became the superpower that it is, that we have embassies all over the world, and we have trade agreements with all these people all over the world, and we're interacting and working out deals with all these other people. But this country had to become a strong nation before it could even think about setting up an embassy in someplace in Russia or China or something like that, and doing business with anybody else. So I think for Black people, very much we're very much in the same situation where, look, unity is a great secondary objective, but it doesn't do any good to be united if you don't control anything, you don't own anything, you have no power, because that can be still reversed just like that anyway. So I say let's get strong, and then after that we can work on the next step.
So this, I think we all can agree, has been a very rich and powerful discussion and film. An excellent way to spend a Saturday afternoon. And I think this would have occurred in person had it not been for the COVID-19 global pandemic. So as we think about the COVID-19 global pandemic and the inequalities that this pandemic has exposed, and the current inequalities that it continues to expose, from the vaccine rollout to the wealth gap, to white privilege and certain people using their privilege to access the vaccine. How do you all, or I should say, discuss the legacy of white supremacy and still its impacts on African American communities, as well as other communities of color, in regard to access to affordable healthcare and quality in health?
Yeah, that's a tough one right there. I mean, I'm a filmmaker, so I'll leave one of the other professors to address that.
Yeah, my specialty is not really with healthcare, so I don't know. The only thing I can say is what's been repeated, which is if there are inequalities that are propagated by a system of white supremacy that limits access to proper care, access to vaccines, to anything that's related to this global pandemic, and with just normal health care, then it should be addressed and it should be reversed. You know, that's the simple answer to me. And if you are somebody who identifies as white and feeds into that system, then you need to understand that there's a choice that you're making to identify with that there's a choice that you can make to reverse that. And if that means setting up more clinics in communities that need more help, then do that. If you feel like you are a doctor and you don't have enough access to people that don't look like you and you're making wrong assumptions because of that, then maybe you need to look at yourself. That's, you know, that's me as a non-medical person saying to people from the medical community is make that choice to change that system that I know very little about, but I do know that everybody has to go to a hospital at some point, and they want to be treated as humans, and not just better because they're white or worse because they're black, or thinking that I you know, just because I'm black, you know, that I'm just like every other black person that they've seen. So recognize that the choices that you're making in treating people, whether you're a nurse, a doctor, the person that is at the front desk, check your privilege, check your assumptions, and give people equal care.
I'd just add that some of the insights we have about how persons of African descent are often treated by white healthcare providers. I mean, we even have examples from famous people, right? We have Serena Williams, who tried to express what was happening to her, and it was ignored, and she almost died. We had a medical doctor of African descent recently who sadly passed away, I believe, from complications with COVID, but who prior to passing kept articulating, these white doctors are not listening to me. And she called them out for presuming that she could tolerate higher levels of pain, again, rooted in this legacy of white supremacy that has included treating people of African descent as subhuman, right? Again, all of those incredible nuanced narratives that worked to justify the enslavement of persons of African descent by good Christians, right? You have to have a rationale that works to justify that. And so if medical providers, healthcare providers today, in order to be able to treat patients as patients and not racialized beings, again, people have to recognize white supremacy. And I know that masses of white people struggle, even those who want to see it, right? So we're not talking about the ideologically white supremacist folks who raged an insurrection on the Capitol in January, earlier this month. Rather, people who have a desire to be fair and just. And even those white people are struggling to see what white supremacy is, how it's within their institutions, and how it is enacted in their daily work. And so this film, Darnley Hodge's film, is a tool that can help. It helps to make visible that water of white supremacy that we all, regardless of our racial classification, were born into, interact with in every institution that we're a part of, because you simply can't. It's not our fault. We were born into this, into a society where these structures are the norm. And so it's not about blame, but it's about how we're going to go forward and to realize the ideals of the nation and of the United Nations that are held out, which include healthcare for all as a human right.
Absolutely. I think, Jackie, you hit the nail on the head. In fact, when you look at the reason, right, eugenics, from the maltreatment and the experimentation on Black bodies, right, particularly Black women bodies, and even to John's point of, and to your point of the mistreatment with Serena Williams, right, the lack of access to healthcare continues. And so, like, thing, even as it relates to this film, is about educating ourselves as African people, is about educating ourselves as people of color with regard to great and excellent health choices. Listen, friends, this has been, again, an excellent conversation, a wonderful time to spend Saturday afternoon. Please let the audience know where they can follow you, reach you. I see Mr. Hodge has posted his contact in the chat. Just take a few moments, each of you all, to express how everyone can get in contact with you.
Well, I'll go first since I have this up. For those who are attending today, if you go to theamericanlows.com and put in this promo code ALXBHM, when you go to purchase the film, you'll get a discount on the film. It's available at The American Lows, which is the name of the film, .com, and just Alexandria Black History Museum, ALXBHM, all right? And you can also please follow us on social media, Blackmore Films on YouTube, on Instagram, and on Facebook. And the film is actually also, until the end of Black History Month, in February, is going to be available on Amazon Prime streaming as well. So those of you who are Amazon Prime customers, you can actually watch it streaming right now on Amazon, and that'll be there until the end of February, because we put it up as a Black History Month special. Somebody asked to repeat the promo code, so I'll go ahead and put it up here again. ALXBHM is the promo code to be able to purchase the film at theamericanlows.com. I also want to let folks know that I'm producing 4 episodes for Black History Month for BET's digital platform called The Breakdown, where I'm doing 4 10-minute episodes on different topics tying modern African-American pop culture into African history. So look for that as well. Starting February 1st, it'll be on BET's digital platform, a 4-part miniseries called The Breakdown that I produced.
And so, well, I'll let you go ahead, Jack.
Oh, I referenced the new book coming, second edition of the book coming out this summer, which I'm super excited about. I put my webpage and email address in the chat. And so I just want to thank the museum personnel, John and Pastor Q, if I may call you such, and especially Darnley Hodge for allowing me to be part of what is so desperately needed, and what you have captured in this film, American Lows. Thank you.
Thank you for being a part of it. You're definitely a critical component, so thank you for doing, and for your research as well, and continued research. I'm looking forward to reading your new book as well, the new iteration of your book.
Thanks. And thank you, John. Great to bounce off some history with you.
Absolutely. And so anybody that wants to reach me, I put my email in the chat. If I'm on all the social media stuff, so it's not hard to find me. I think I'm the only John West Bay that spells my name Jon with a West-Bay. So I don't think it's hard to find me. But one of the things I want to call people's attention to is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there's a new museum project that's being built there called Greenwood Rising. It talks about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. That is an important bit of history. If you don't know about it, we could spend a whole other program talking about that. But it speaks to a lot of what we've been talking about today. It's an important part of our history. If you want to know more about it, reach out to me. And of course, I want to thank Audrey, who I've known for, I don't want to say how many years, because it'll age both of us. But thank you so much for putting this together. Thank you, Pastor Q. Thank you, Jacqueline. And Darnley, we go back probably 25 years. And, I'm glad to see this important film being put out, and things that we've been talking about for years being put out. And I'm glad that everybody's responding to it very well. So thanks.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank our audience. We've had an amazing discussion. I want to also say, if you've missed anything in the chat or want to reach out to me at the museum, I can help you, facilitate you getting in touch with anyone. My email is audrey.davis@alexandriava.gov. I also want to bring everyone's attention to our next ACP program, which will be Edward Ball, the author Edward Ball, on January 28th at 7 p.m. And he will be speaking on his new book, Life of a Klansman, A Family History and White Supremacy. And many of us in Alexandria know Edward Ball, not only for his book, Slaves in the Family, but also for the article that he did a few years ago in Smithsonian Magazine on Slavery's Trail of Tears, where he references our site, Freedom House, here in Alexandria. So it's an interesting lecture. I think it will be a great companion piece to the film. And we hope that you will join us for future lectures with the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project. Please check back to our website. We have some great webinars and lectures coming up for you in March. So again, many thanks to our panelists. It was an incredibly powerful film. Please use the discount code to get your copy and to view it. Share it with your friends. I have to tell the panelists that, oh, thank you. Thank you, Darnley, for putting that back up. I have to say that we have been receiving emails and texts while the film was going on with people dying to get in touch with you, wanting to screen it, saying how important it is. Some city agencies have reached out about screening it as well. So many, many thanks to you and to our fantastic moderator for keeping us going and keeping us on track.
Indeed,
so
indeed.
Very many thanks. Have a wonderful weekend. Be safe, be well, and join us again soon. Thank you.